All right, so let's dive into this Sydney train strike chaos. I know it's going to be frustrating for you guys out there. Whether you're crammed onto a bus, walking miles, sweating it out, or missing out on plans, this is messing everyone up.
Yeah, it's certainly making news and impacting a ton of people. But you know what's interesting? If you step back and think about strikes like this one in Sydney, it's kind of like a piece of this much bigger story,
Hmm.
one that goes way back, centuries even. It's this constant back and forth push and pull between the workers and those in charge.
Kind of like a historical tug of war.
Exactly.
So who are the main players in this Sydney showdown?
Well, on one side, we've got the rail, tram, and bus union,
Okay.
the RTBU representing the train workers. They're the ones who called for the strike. And on the other side is the New South Wales government. They're in charge of public transport and the state budget.
So it's the RTBU versus the NSW government. What are they actually fighting about?
Seems like the core of it is wages. The RTBU wants some pretty big pay raises, but the government's pushing back, saying those demands are too much and we can't afford it.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's this whole other layer of tension. The union wants 24-hour train service,
Oh, wow.
which the government is completely against, saying it's not practical and would cost a fortune.
I bet those late-night Pearl Jam concert goers and A-League fans wish they had that 24-hour service right now.
It's
You know, we've been looking at articles from the Sydney Morning Herald, the Daily Telegraph, and ABC News, and they all paint a really clear picture of how big of a deal this strike is. It's a 4-day shutdown.
Yep, a huge disruption. Imagine those Pearl Jam fans traveling from all over only to get stranded because the trains aren't running,
Right.
or A-League fans trying to get around without their usual trains. It's a logistical nightmare for big events like that.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention the millions of people who rely on Sydney trains every single day just to get to work, school, or appointments.
And speaking of nightmares, the news articles are using some strong language. The Daily Telegraph even calls the union leaders dictators.
Wow.
And the union says the government forced their hand into taking this drastic step. This is definitely more than just about the numbers on a paycheck.
You're right. Those strong reactions tell us there's something deeper going on. Strikes, looking back through history, usually come from this mix of economic fears, social tensions, and even political agendas. It's rarely just about the money.
Okay, so we're talking about values, power dynamics, and maybe even a little bit of drama.
Yeah.
So before we dive back into what's happening in Sydney, let's go back in time and see what we can learn from other strikes. Where should we start?
Let's rewind to the late 1800s in the U.S. Imagine a country still recovering from the Civil War.
Okay.
Industrialization is transforming everything, and there's this wave of economic hardship sweeping across the nation.
Hmm.
And that's where we find the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It really captures the raw power and those simmering tensions that can explode in a strike.
The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Sounds pretty intense. Paint us a picture. Why were the railroad workers so upset?
Well, it was a really uncertain time economically.
Quite.
The Panic of 1873 had triggered this financial crisis,
Hmm.
which led to a lot of unemployment and wages being cut.
Yeah.
The railroad industry, which was a big symbol of American progress and expansion, was hit especially hard. Workers were dealing with awful conditions, working long hours, and their paychecks were shrinking.
So they were getting squeezed, both in terms of the economy and their working conditions.
Mhm.
What was the final straw?
The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad decided to cut wages again.
Uh,
And this was the second time in a short period. That was it. Workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia walked off the job. And that sparked this chain reaction that spread like wildfire across the entire country.
wow, so it wasn't just a local thing. This was a national uprising. What happened next?
Everything stopped. Rail traffic completely froze. It was chaos. Protests broke out in cities all over the country. Some of them turned violent, clashes with the authorities.
Oh, wow.
The government got really worried, thought the whole system was about to collapse, so they responded with force. They sent in federal troops to try and regain control.
Federal troops. Wow. That really gives you a sense of how big and intense this strike was. It sounds like something straight out of a history book.
It was a defining moment in American labor history. It exposed how divided and unequal things were during the Industrial Revolution and showed how vulnerable workers were in a rapidly changing economy. The Great Railroad Strike might have ended, but things were still simmering.
Yeah.
The late 1800s were kind of a hotbed for labor unrest, and just a couple decades later, another massive strike hit the Pullman strike of 1894.
The Pullman strike. Okay, so we're still in the U.S., still in that era of industrialization. What was going on that led to this?
Imagine a whole town owned and run by the Pullman Palace Car Company. They made those fancy sleeper cars for trains.
Right.
And the workers, they lived in company housing, shopped at company stores. Their whole lives were controlled by the company.
Sounds almost like a feudal system.
Mm.
That must have been stifling.
It was. And then when the Panic of 1893 happened, Pullman cut wages but kept the rents and prices in the company town high. Workers were struggling to get by, stuck in a system that felt rigged against them.
So it was bound to blow up. What was the trigger?
3 workers got fired for trying to talk to George Pullman himself about their grievances.
Oh, wow.
That started a walkout, and pretty soon, thousands of Pullman workers were on strike.
Thousands. This wasn't just a local dispute then, was it?
No, it became a national crisis really fast.
Okay.
The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, called for a boycott of any train using Pullman cars.
Eugene V. Debs, wasn't he a socialist? That adds another layer to it, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
shows how these labor rights were tied up with bigger social and political movements.
Absolutely. The boycott crippled rail traffic all over the country. And again, the government stepped in with force. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to break the strike, said they needed to keep the mail running and maintain order.
So the government saw the strike as a threat to the whole country.
They did. The Pullman strike ended with the workers losing, but it had a lasting impact. It showed how strong the unions were becoming, the power of solidarity strikes, and that the government was willing to use force against labor movements.
So it's like there was this pattern forming. Workers want fair treatment, companies push back, and the government usually sides with business.
Yeah.
Did this keep going into the 1900s?
It did. But the 20th century also brought a new wave of strikes. This time it wasn't just about better pay, it was also about dignity and respect. A really powerful example is the Lawrence textile strike of 1912, also called the Bread and Roses strike.
Bread and Roses. That's a really poetic name for a strike.
What?
What's the story there?
It happened in Lawrence, Massachusetts, a town all about textiles.
Okay.
The workers were mostly immigrants, a lot of them women, dealing with terrible conditions and low wages. A new law cut the maximum working hours for women, which was good.
Right.
But then the mill owners cut their pay to match the shorter hours.
Oh, wow. So even a small victory, like fewer hours, came with a catch. That's going to be infuriating.
It was. The workers were sick of barely surviving all the time. They walked off the job, demanding a living wage, but also a life with dignity and beauty, hence the bread and roses.
So they were fighting for more than just scraping by. They wanted a life that included those essential things, the bread, but also the finer things, the roses.
Exactly. And their demands resonated way beyond Lawrence.
Yeah.
The strike got national attention partly because of the powerful image of children being sent away to stay with supporters in other states.
Children separated from their families. That's heartbreaking. Did it work?
It definitely got people's sympathy and put pressure on the mill owners. The strike lasted 2 months, and in the end, the workers got a big raise.
Wow, so they actually shifted things. Did that victory have a ripple effect on other labor movements?
It did. The Lawrence strike helped inspire other workers to organize and fight for better conditions. It highlighted how important collective action is and how crucial public support is for these movements.
Seems like the labor movement was really gaining traction. What happened next in this whole saga?
Well, as we get into the 1910s, we see the rise of these general strikes where workers from all sorts of industries join forces to shut down a whole city.
A whole city shutting down.
Yeah. The Seattle General Strike of 1919 is a great example.
Wow. What were the workers in Seattle hoping to achieve?
Over 65,000 workers walked off the job.
Wow.
They wanted higher wages and better working conditions across all kinds of industries, shipbuilding, trucking, you name it. They pretty much shut down the whole city for 5 days.
5 days. That's a bold move. How did the city and the government react to that?
It was a tense situation. The mayor called in federal troops, thought there was going to be a Bolshevik revolution.
Wow.
The strike didn't achieve all of its goals right away, but it showed just how powerful general strikes could be. And it got people talking about the role of labor in society.
So even if it wasn't a total victory, it planted the seeds for future action and got the conversation going in the right direction.
Exactly. And then moving into the 1930s, we come to one of the most famous strikes in American history, the Flint sit-down strike.
Flint, Michigan. Wasn't that a huge center for the auto industry?
It was, and this strike targeted General Motors, one of the big 3 automakers. The workers were tired of the terrible conditions, the speed-ups on the assembly line, and the lack of recognition for their union. So instead of just walking out, they decided to occupy the factories, wouldn't leave until their demands were met.
Occupying the factories. That's a whole other level of commitment. What was at stake in this standoff?
The stakes were huge. The strike went on for 44 days, and it became a symbol of worker resistance across the country.
Wow.
They faced down the police trying to kick them out, went through a lot of hardship, but their determination paid off.
So they actually won. How did they manage to pull that off?
Their courage and solidarity really caught the public's imagination. They had support from other unions, people in the community, even some politicians. Finally, General Motors gave in, recognized the United Auto Workers Union, and agreed to negotiate a contract.
Wow. They forced one of the most powerful companies in the world to the bargaining table. That's a historic win.
It was. The Flint sit-down strike was a turning point for the labor movement in the U.S. It ushered in an era of stronger unions and collective bargaining, which led to big improvements in wages and working conditions for millions of workers.
This whole journey through the history of strikes is really fascinating. It's amazing to see how these struggles have shaped not just working conditions, but also broader social and political landscapes. Where do we go from here in our timeline?
As we move into the post-war era, things get even more complex for labor relations, new challenges and wins popping up. The Oakland General Strike of 1946 is a good example of how the fight for workers' rights kept evolving.
Oakland, California. Not exactly the first place you think of when it comes to labor battles. What happened there?
It started as a fight between department store workers and their bosses about wages and union recognition.
Okay.
But it quickly grew into a citywide shutdown, with over 100,000 workers from all sorts of industries joining the picket lines.
Over 100,000 workers. That shows you how powerful solidarity can be and how frustrated a lot of workers were at the time.
Exactly. The Oakland General Strike lasted 2 days and paralyzed the whole city. It was a huge show of strength for labor, but it also exposed the growing tensions between unions and employers in the post-war world.
It's like they're saying, we helped win the war, now it's time for us to share in the peace and prosperity.
Exactly. And this theme of economic justice kept driving labor movements in the 1950s, especially in the giant steel strike of 1959.
Steel. That's the backbone of American industry.
Yeah.
What was on the line in that strike?
A lot. Over 500,000 steelworkers walked off the job.
Wow.
They wanted higher pay, better benefits, and safer working conditions. It was one of the biggest strikes in U.S. history, lasted an incredible 116 days.
116 days. That's almost 4 months. It must have had a massive impact on the steel industry and the economy as a whole.
It did. The strike shut down steel production, which caused shortages and disruptions everywhere. It was a real battle of wills between the United Steelworkers Union and the big steel companies.
So who came out on top in that epic showdown?
It was a tough fight, and in the end, the steelworkers did win some concessions, got higher wages and better benefits. But the strike also showed how hard it was becoming for labor movements to succeed in an economy that was changing so rapidly.
What do you mean by an economy that was changing so rapidly?
Well, automation and globalization were starting to change the very nature of work. The steel industry was particularly vulnerable to those shifts, and this strike exposed the fears and uncertainty many workers had about their future.
It sounds like a key moment, a glimpse of the challenges that were coming for the labor movement.
It was. And then, as we get to the 1960s, a decade of social and political upheaval, the fight for workers' rights took on new dimensions. The movements for racial and economic justice were often intertwined with labor struggles.
The 1960s, a time of protests, civil rights marches, and counterculture. How did that energy show up in the labor movement?
One of the most inspiring stories from the 60s is the Delano Grape Strike, which lasted from 1965 to 1970. This was a fight for farm worker rights, led by Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union.
Cesar Chavez, he's a legend in the labor movement. What led to this strike?
Picture the grape fields of Delano, California. Thousands of farm workers, mainly Filipino and Mexican American, toiling away under the hot sun, picking grapes for practically nothing.
Yeah.
They faced horrible conditions, exposure to pesticides, and no basic worker protections.
It's like the system was built to exploit them. What were they asking for?
Better wages, safer conditions, and for their union to be recognized. But this fight was about more than just economic demands. It was about dignity and respect, having their humanity recognized.
So they were challenging not just how labor worked, but also deep-seated social norms and prejudices.
Exactly. And their methods reflected this bigger vision. They organized boycotts, marches, and fasts, making the whole country pay attention to what farm workers were going through. Their nonviolent resistance, inspired by figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., really resonated with the social justice movements happening at the time.
It's amazing how all these threads of activism were connected back then. What happened with the Delano grape strike?
It was a long and difficult fight, but the farm workers ultimately won.
Wow.
After 5 years, the big grape growers agreed to recognize the United Farm Workers Union and sign contracts that gave them better pay and conditions.
So their persistence and bravery actually transformed the industry. That's incredible.
It was. The Delano grape strike proved the power of boycotts and nonviolent resistance, and it inspired other movements for social and economic justice.
It sounds like the labor movement was really hitting its stride. Did this momentum continue into the 1970s?
It did, but things were also becoming more complicated for labor relations. New economic and political challenges were popping up.
Okay.
In 1970, over 200,000 postal workers went on strike all across the country, wanting better pay, better conditions, and the right to collective bargaining.
The Postal Service?
Yeah.
That's a vital part of our infrastructure. How did the government react to a strike that big?
It was a big disruption for sure. Mail delivery stopped all over the country. President Nixon actually called in the National Guard to try and get the mail moving again.
Calling in the National Guard. That sounds serious. How did it all end?
This strike lasted 8 days and ended when Congress passed a law giving postal workers the right to collective bargaining. But they didn't get the right to strike, so it was a partial win for the workers. But it also showed how difficult it was for public sector unions to fight for their rights.
It's like even as workers were making progress, there were always forces trying to push back and limit their power.
Yeah, that's been a common theme throughout history. And then in the 1980s, with the rise of conservative politics and neoliberal economic policies, the power dynamic between workers and those in charge shifted dramatically.
The 1980s, the Reagan era. I have a feeling this is where our story takes a darker turn.
It's a pivotal moment for sure, and one that still affects the labor movement today. In 1981, more than 11,000 air traffic controllers, members of PETSHIS, went on strike. They wanted safer working conditions, better pay, and stronger safety measures.
Air traffic controllers, that's a really high-pressure job with huge responsibility. I can only imagine their demands were pretty reasonable.
They were, but President Reagan took a hard line. He said the strike was illegal and fired all the striking controllers, banned them from ever working for the federal government again.
Fired them all. That's a huge move. What impact did that have?
It was a shock to the labor movement. It marked a new era of aggression towards unions. Employers felt bolder about taking a harder line against workers trying to organize. The firing of the PATTO workers was a turning point. It led to a drop in union membership and weakened labor's bargaining power, something that continues to this day.
It's a tough reminder that progress isn't always straightforward. Sometimes there are setbacks, moments that feel like outright defeats.
True, but the spirit of solidarity and the fight for workers' rights, those never die. In 1997, we see union power make a comeback with the UPS strike.
UPS, the package delivery company.
Yeah.
What are the issues in that strike?
Over 185,000 UPS workers, members of the Teamsters Union, walked off the job. They were demanding better pay, better benefits, and more job security. They were especially worried about the growing use of part-time workers who were paid less and got fewer benefits.
Job security, that's a big one, especially as the economy was becoming more globalized and automated.
Definitely. And the UPS strike, which lasted 15 days and messed up package deliveries all across the U.S., really caught the public's attention. It highlighted those growing anxieties about the changing world of work and the need for well-paying, secure jobs.
So it was kind of a David versus Goliath story with the workers winning out against a corporate giant.
It was a significant win for the Teamsters. They got raises limits on using part-timers and better benefits. The strike showed that unions still had power, even as globalization and downsizing were happening everywhere.
Okay, this journey through the history of strikes has been eye-opening. We've seen how these struggles have shaped working conditions, but also bigger social values and power dynamics. Now I'm really keen to bring it all back to the present day. How do all these historical lessons help us understand what's happening with the train strike in Sydney right now?
That's the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
and that's where we're going to pick things up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at how this Sydney standoff is likely to play out, based on what history has taught us, and explore the potential outcomes for both the RTBU and the New South Wales government.
Don't go anywhere, listeners. We're about to connect the past to the present and see what we can learn about the future. All right, so we've gone through this wild history of strikes from the railroads back in the 1800s, all the way to package deliveries in the late 1900s.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back to right now to Sydney, and that train strike that's probably got you scrambling for a way to get around.
It really is amazing how much this Sydney situation mirrors those historical struggles we just talked about. It's the same story. Workers want something, the government pushes back, and the public feels the impact.
So knowing what we know now about strikes from the past, how do you think this is all going to play out in Sydney? What are the likely scenarios?
Well, if history is any guide, the most likely way this gets resolved is through some good old-fashioned collective bargaining and negotiation.
Right.
The RTBU and the New South Wales government, they'll need to sit down, hash things out, and find a deal that addresses those core issues, especially wages and working conditions.
Okay, so compromise, give and take. What about the Fair Work Commission? What role do they play in all this?
The Fair Work Commission is like the referee in this whole industrial relations game. They can step in to help settle disputes, guide the parties towards an agreement, and sometimes if things get really stuck, they can even make a decision that everyone has to follow.
So they're there to make sure it's a fair process and hopefully a fair outcome for both sides. But what happens if those negotiations fall apart? Is there anything else the government or the union can do?
Well, the government could always step in, go beyond the Fair Work Commission. They could try to pass new laws, offer incentives, or use their political clout to try to influence things.
And I'm sure public opinion plays a role too, right? If commuters are getting fed up with all the disruptions and everyone's on one side, that could force the other to give in.
Yeah, absolutely. Public perception can be a game changer, and the media, they have a huge influence on that. So how this strike gets portrayed in the news and on social media could definitely sway
It's a
things.
battle for people's opinions, just as much as it's about contracts and negotiations. So let's play out some possibilities. What would a best case resolution look like?
Best case, the RTBU and the NSW government find some middle ground through talking, and maybe with a little nudge from the Fair Work Commission. Maybe the union accepts a slightly smaller pay bump than they originally wanted, but in return they get some big wins on working conditions,
Okay.
maybe something on safety concerns or more flexible schedules.
A win-win where everyone feels like they got something, even if it's not everything they wanted at first. But what about the opposite? What's the worst case scenario?
Worst case, it drags on and on with no end in sight. The strike could last weeks, even months, causing huge damage to the economy, making commuters even more frustrated, and creating this bitter divide between the government and the unions.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good for anyone, not the people involved and not the city as a whole.
Ah,
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's bring it back to you, our listener. What can you expect in the coming days?
it's hard to say for sure, but the best thing to do is keep an eye on the Transport for NSW website and their app. They'll have the most up-to-date info on any disruptions. And even if the strike ends soon, it'll take a while for everything to get back to normal.
So be prepared for some delays and cancellations.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good time to dust off that bike or remember how much fun walking can be.
And hey, while you're dealing with the hassle of this strike, maybe take a moment to think about the bigger picture. We've seen how workers have fought for fair treatment throughout history
Hmm.
and how these power dynamics play out time and time again.
It's a reminder that even in our modern tech-driven world, those basic questions about workers' rights, economic fairness, and who really holds the power, those are still just as relevant as ever.
And as you think about those questions, remember, you're not just watching this all happen.
Right.
You're part of this ongoing story, a story that plays out every day in workplaces, in negotiations, and out in the streets.
So stay informed, stay involved, and stay curious. And maybe next time you find yourself stuck because of a transit strike, you'll see it as more than just a hassle. You'll see it as part of a much bigger story, a story that we're all part of.